Hey girl, hey! Welcome to With a Gay Twist. We are a bi-weekly podcast hosted by two homosexuals who talk about news and politics, but with a gay twist. I am Zach, and the car that made these two equal-length tire marks had pause attraction. You can't make these marks without pause attraction, which was not available on the 64 Buick Skylark. I'm sorry, was that too much? Did I go too far?
No, that was perfect. Of course, I am Mason, and Hot Patootie, bless my soul, it's going to be a good one tonight.
Mama, it is. On today's podcast, we're going to be talking about some very heavy topics. Voting rights. I know, not the most scandalous sounding thing, but actually more scandalous than you think it would be. Because voting rights, they got some issues today, Mama.
Today,
they got some issues.
Yesterday, 50 years ago.
200 years.
Yeah.
And then a little bit later, we will be learning about a queer person in history we think you should know. Mason, tell us, who are we going to be learning about today?
We are going to be learning about a World War II veteran, and it's Christine Jorgensen. We'll learn all about her later.
Ooh, fascinating. I cannot wait to hear her story.
Oops,
I'm sure
and
there's...
sorry to interrupt, but that means it's time for the Interruption. That's right. It's a segment where we discuss the intersectionality between news, politics, and queerness.
I love this segment.
I love this segment. This is our new segment. And
it is.
So today we're going to be talking about the intersectionality between blood bans, talking about blood donation bans with the Red Cross, and queerness, right? So a lot of times we want to help people, right? People go out there and volunteer. People want to get out there and help during major disasters. People want to help loved ones that are dealing with sickness. We know that there are people that are organ donors. And then we have the Red Cross.
Then we have the Red Cross bouncing up in there like Shangela out of that box, unexpected, and everyone's going, what the hell is she doing here?
Yes, ma'am. And they're not as fun as Angela, not as well dressed.
They're not.
And it's been a problem for a while.
It has been a problem for a while. In fact, I have a personal story about the Red Cross and donating blood. I used to love donating blood. I did it regularly. But every time I went and they would send me through to the nurse and give me the questionnaire, they would get to a question, which was, based on my memory, have you had sexual contact with another man even once since 1977? And every time I would lie. I would say, nope, I sure haven't. And I had been. Now, I was practicing safe sex and being tested, so I was not putting anyone in any extraordinary danger, but I wanted to donate blood, and I knew that I was not allowed to because I was gay. So I lied, and I continued to do that up until my mid-20s, when I eventually got to the place where I couldn't do it anymore. I was officially coming out of the closet to more than just like one or two people, and I didn't want to lie anymore. And so I went back to donate blood, and I knew I was going to tell them the truth, and I told them the truth, and they turned me away. And I have never donated blood since.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you felt that you weren't putting anyone at any extraordinary risk because you were practicing safe sex, you were getting tested regularly, which is all fantastic and good. But according to the Red Cross, since 1983, just the fact that we were having male-to-male sexual contact, which they defined as a many great deal of things. So they're not just talking about intercourse, and they're not just talking about oral sex. They're talking about any type of sexual activity that you could possibly imagine.
I mean, a hand job is
Correct.
considered sexual contact.
Yep. The blood ban from the Red Cross, and also in France, which is why this topic is coming up now, was instituted in 1983. And what's really interesting is that what you brought up, when they instituted this ban, they said, okay, any male who has had sexual contact with another man since 1977, so 6 years prior to the ban being instituted, could not donate blood. And it was just a ban all the way up until December 2015 in the US. The FDA lifts the moratorium or the ban on blood donations from homosexual men or men that have had sexual contact with another man, no matter how you identify, right? From total ban to now, if you have practiced 12 months of celibacy, then we are going to allow you to donate blood. France, a year later, lifts their ban in 2016. They followed same suit as what we did here in the US. They established a 12-month requirement for celibacy for the previous year. What was nice is that France kind of jumped ahead in 2019 and said, okay, we're going to take this 12 months and bring it down to 4 months. We didn't adjust that 12-month period until 2020, April of 2020. We brought it down from 12 months to 3 months. So we're kind
At
of
the
doing
start of the
this
pandemic.
at the start of the pandemic. Now, understand that all the while, blood is still tested no matter who
Which
you
is what I
are.
think is funny about the whole thing is you're telling an entire group of people you are not allowed to donate blood because there may be a chance that you have some sort of illness. Meanwhile, that illness and every other illness known to man is tested for before the blood gets anywhere near someone else's body.
Yes, but according to the Red Cross's website, those tests are not 100% foolproof, which we know. We understand that, okay,
What
when
is
we
100% foolproof?
correct, but the fact that no test is going to be 100%, right? When you're doing testing, there's going to be false negatives, there's going to be false positives. But the Red Cross used this as their justification of, well, just because there's a higher prevalence of this in your community, we're going to institute a ban. And this is what a lot of advocacy groups were getting down to when they were advocating for the removal of these bans, which France is doing as of March 16th. They announced recently, this past month in January, that they will no longer have a celibacy requirement for men that practice homosexual sexual acts, or any male that has said that they had sexual contact with another man at any point in time.
Thank you, France.
Thank you,
for being on the
France.
forefront of this and doing the right thing.
Thank you, France, for recognizing that the policy is discriminatory and that we should be rejecting or denying donors based on an individual case of risk assessment and not just a carte blanche ban based on sexual orientation.
I mean, it just doesn't make sense whenever you've got so many people who need blood. You look at how many people are denied the ability to donate blood who would be willing to donate blood if you accepted it. But because of some stupid ass reason, you're going to say, no, we're not going to take it. If they announced tomorrow that they were going to start accepting gay men's blood, I would be going to my local blood bank and starting my regular donations every 57 days, every 58 days, whatever it was. I would be doing that.
Sign me up.
Well, thank you, France. We really appreciate you doing the right thing. We think that the world should follow your example, and we can only hope that soon the United States will do the same thing.
Really hoping that the U.S. sees this as forward movement. I mean, the American Medical Association had already voted in 2013 to end this policy, and the Red Cross houses and manages their own donation policies as far as their denial policies. So even though the AMA, made up of doctors, said this is a egregious discrimination policy, the Red Cross has just said no. So I'm really hoping that they take France's step and just do it.
Just get rid of it.
Yeah. So now that we're done talking about the Red Cross and their policies, Zach, what's new?
It's the segment where we talk about the news that caught our eye this week. This week, it has been a troubling week. Not only this week, last week, the last few weeks, the last few months, the last few years, as a matter of fact, for the issue of voting rights.
Hot, heated, and heavy, honey.
Oh.
Hot, heated,
if you have not
heavy.
been following what's been happening, it's been pretty terrible. It's been season 7 of RuPaul's Drag Race terrible. It's been not great. Not great. So here's what's happening with voting rights. In case you didn't know, voting is one of the things that makes America a great country. It is one of the things that makes a democracy a democracy, is the voice of the people going into a ballot box and pulling the lever for a candidate or for an issue. It is the foundation of our country. Except there are some who would prefer if some people did not vote and only certain people voted.
They want to keep us silent.
They do. They want to keep us silent. They want to keep a lot of minorities silent. They want to keep poor people silent. They want to keep indigenous people silent. They want to keep trans people silent. They want to keep a lot of people silent, so that really it's just the suburban conservative white folk that get to vote.
They're trying to take us from Greek democracy to Roman republic, where just the rich white property owning people have a say in how we're governed and what changes are implemented.
Exactly. So voting rights have been taking a lot of hits lately. So we thought we'd take today to talk about some of the hits it's been taking and what you can do to try to combat that. So here's what's happening with voting rights. But before we can do that, I think it's probably best that we back up a little and let's have a crash course. That's right. We're going to do a little crash course on the history of voting rights in America. So we tend to think that voting rights is really everyone has the right to vote. Usually once you're over the age of 18, you get to go and you get to vote. And that's open to everyone. Well, that's not how it started. When the country was founded, the founders had some blind spots about several things. But one of them was about voting rights. And originally, the people who were allowed to vote were white, landowning men. That's it. No women, no poor people, no people of color, just the white landowning men. So our founders had some issues, but for sure. But over time, over the decades, little by little, voting rights were granted to other groups of people. After the Civil War in 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed. That ensured that a person could not be denied the right to vote based on their race or color. So, hello African Americans, welcome to voting. Except the South, they weren't too happy with the 15th Amendment. They thought it was as bad as the rules to All Stars 3.
Except that they still wanted the African American population counted for census purposes, so that they still had equal representation within our centralized government. They still
Oh,
wanted to
sure.
use the Three-Fifths Compromise in order to make sure that they had power and that the northern states couldn't just bulldoze over them.
But God forbid they actually have the right to vote.
God forbid they actually have a voice.
Yeah, so African Americans in the South faced some tremendous obstacles in voting after the 15th Amendment was passed. And that was the Jim Crow era. And by the 1950s, through decades of Jim Crow, the civil rights movement had really been galvanizing the nation, and Congress had passed several acts in 1957 and 1960 and 1964 to try to level the playing field when it came to civil rights and voting rights. But none of them really had the teeth to really get shit done. And then we reached the pinnacle of voting rights, which was Bloody Sunday. For those of you who don't know, Bloody Sunday was on March 7th, 1965. There was a very peaceful voting rights protest that happened in Selma, Alabama. And these protesters were met by the state police of Alabama, who just proceeded to beat the shit out of them while news cameras filmed the whole thing. It was terrible, it was horrible, and it sort of shook the nation. And Congress sort of responded to this by passing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 shortly thereafter. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 65 was huge. It was the landmark case that changed everything. When you think of landmark Supreme Court cases, you might think of Brown versus Board of Education. You might think of Roe v. Wade. You might think of Ogerfeld. The Voting Rights Act of 65 is one of those just landmark cases that'll go down in history as really transforming the country. So its goal was to increase the number of people who could register to vote. It outlawed literacy tests, which, I mean, literally, the literacy tests were insane. Most people could not pass them, but they would only make black people try to take them. They were ridiculous. They also provided for the appointment of federal examiners to go and look at certain states who had a history of voting discrimination to make sure that they were minding their P's and Q's and not being discriminatory. A lot of those states were in the South, and if they ever did decide they wanted to change something about their voting practices or procedures, those certain states who had this history of discrimination had to get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice, from the Attorney General, to make sure they were changing things in a fair way and they weren't going to be changing things to be discriminatory like they used to be. It was lovely, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 then stood the test of time and for decades protected minorities and poor people from being denied the right to vote. It single-handedly expanded the electorate and allowed for a more democratic process. It was beautiful, Mason. Beautiful.
Fabulous. And we would love to end the podcast right here, wrap it up, and be all done talking about voting rights. However,
we cannot. Girl, then the fucked up shit happened. In June of 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
like a fish, honey.
Gutted it like a fish and threw its entrails back out into the Boston Harbor and said, oh yeah, you don't really need that anymore. I mean, racism's over. We live in a post-racial America. If you didn't know, like, we have a black guy who's president now, and
We're
so
colorblind.
yeah, like, the country's not colorblind. Like, thanks Obama for taking care of all that. Yeah, that's essentially what they thought. They ruled that one specific part of the Voting Rights Act, which was Section 4B, that contained the coverage formula that determined which jurisdictions were subject to the preclearance that we talked about. They determined that that was discriminatory in voting and it is unconstitutional. So without that central part of it, the rest of it was toothless. So they essentially dismantled it.
A big lesson to learn for those people that are writing legislation, that you can't just have one part of your bill be the cornerstone, the keystone that everything operates off of. You need to make sure you diversify that shit to all the other parts, and make sure that there is kind of a network of cogs and wheels.
Well, this was the Voting Rights Act. They just had one bouncer outside the club making sure that no straight people got in and it was only the queers allowed in. And then when the Supreme Court ruled that that bouncer was unconstitutional, that's it. Now all the straights are invading the gay club and they're over there on the dance floor and the straight guys are taking their shirts off and they're gay baiting, and that's not cool. So that case that determined that the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional was Shelby County versus Eric Holder. Eric Holder was the Attorney General at the time, and Shelby County is the county in Tennessee on the far western corner of Tennessee. It's the county that has Memphis.
Memphis.
Walking in Memphis, walking with my feet 10 feet off a Beale. So, the Shelby County case removed the protections that poor people, minorities had. And so, what do you think the conservatives did the very next day, Mason?
Through a party.
They threw a big ass party and
Probably
said,
called it a fiesta.
probably.
Committed some acts of cultural appropriation.
Oh, 100%. Oh, you know there were taco bowls as far as the eye could see.
They had sombreros.
A pinata for sure.
Probably. Ugh.
And then they proceeded to start dismantling state voting laws and passing a lot of legislation to make it harder to vote and to make it more difficult for specifically poor people and minorities to vote.
It was the anti-Oprah moment.
It
wasn't you
it
get
was,
it. It was we take it from you. We take it from you. We take it from you. We take it from you.
It was like Rambo going around just shredding voting rights around the country. Now, naturally, Democrats and people who care about the democratic process try to come up with another idea. So someone decided to, let's just try to pass another law that provides better protections for voting rights. And that is where we got the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2019, which eventually became the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which named after the late Congressman John Lewis, who is sorely missed and would be devastated to know the state of this country right now. Because, remember when we were talking about Bloody Sunday before? Mm-hmm. You know who was walking in one of those protest lines on that day in a peaceful protest and got the shit beat out of him that day on TV?
I wonder who.
It was a Mr. John Lewis.
Yeah.
And Mason, I would love to say that when the act was introduced in Congress, it was met with applause and awe and praise. And it sort of was. It sort of was and sort of wasn't. So here's what happened. What happened was when they introduced the bill in the House in August of 2021, it received 223 co-sponsors. Huge. The bill then passed the House on August 24th, 2021. The vote was 219 to 212. Does that number sound familiar?
I wonder if that's a party line.
It sure is. Every single Democrat voted in favor of the legislation, and every single Republican voted against it.
So, 10 months of this bullcrap of the big lie, the election was stolen from us. Then it's introduced in August. So, what are the Republicans doing when they're voting against this?
They're trying to appease Trump and say, don't worry, Trump, we're on your side.
Don't worry, Trump. Don't worry, Trumpsters. Because guess what's happening next year in 2022? Midterm
Midterms.
elections. So not only do we have things happening before that brought voting rights and access to voting into the forefront because we had a presidential candidate who couldn't accept a loss after numerous cases went to numerous state supreme courts that proved that there was no large scale voter fraud in any jurisdiction, right? But then we have Republicans that have sat and fought and tried to push this agenda and this story. And now they're looking ahead and going, crap, if I support this, which was introduced by by a Democrat, then I'm going to lose the support of the Trumpsters and I'm not going to have my job come 2023.
Yeah. So, sadly, well, it passed the House, which was great. But again, all the Democrats voted for it, all the Republicans voted against it. So it then moves to the Senate. And then on November 3rd, 2021, it did not pass the Senate because it needed not 51 votes,
60.
it needed 60 because Republicans will filibuster anything that they don't like. So, sadly, the bill has died, and we will have to take this up on another day. But while, again, this has dismantled the protections, so with the protections gone, what are states doing to pass these restrictive laws? Well, as we're wrapping up here, here's just a list of some of these restrictive laws and what these states are trying to pass. They're trying to pass laws that will shorten the window that you can apply for a mail-in ballot. They are passing laws to shorten the deadline in which you can have that ballot delivered, to restrict assistance in returning a voter's mail-in ballot, to reduce polling place availability, both the locations and the hours that they're open, to make voter registration more difficult, to make it harder to remain on absentee voting lists, to limit the number, location, or availability of mail-in ballot drop boxes, to limit early voting days and hours, to increase the number of voters per precinct, meaning you're more likely to have long lines, to increase barriers for voters with disabilities, to increase stricter signature requirements for mail-in ballots, to impose harsher voter ID requirements.
And that one's important. I mean, all these are important. Don't get me wrong, but specifically for our queer community, the imposition of harsher voter ID requirements really impacts those that do not present as the gender identity that is listed on their government ID, or even those that are gender fluid and may not wish to change what the government ID or their identification shows, but they present on any given day as something that doesn't necessarily match a heteronormative binary description or idea of what a man or what a woman looks like. So
Yeah.
with imposing these harsher voter ID requirements, that's just one level.
Yeah, it is. They're also trying to expand voter purges and risk faulty voter purges and eliminate or limit sending in mail-in ballots to voters who didn't specifically request them. They're also trying to eliminate or limit sending mail-in ballot applications to voters who didn't specifically request them. And this is the one I really don't like. They're trying to ban snacks and water from being handed out to voters who are waiting in line. So you got one law saying we're going to increase the number of voters per precinct, which is going to mean you're going to have long lines. And people standing out there for hours and hours and hours. Oh, and by the way, while you're standing out there for hours and hours and hours, no one can come by and give you water. No one can come by and give you a snack.
Guess what this reminds me of? Theme park wait lines for rides that require you to use a locker. And those lines are sometimes 3 hours long, looking at you, Hagrid. And they're doing the same thing to voting experience. We already have long lines. We actually want to have long lines at voting booths.
Yeah, I would say we want long lines that move quickly. I mean, the long lines is great because it does show, yeah, more people are interested in getting out there. But we don't want people out there standing for hours. We want it to be a nice long line that, oh my gosh, look, within 10 minutes we're inside.
Right. I do not want the Disney experience.
So, thanks, Republicans, for making it harder to vote for a lot of people. You suck.
Now, what I will say, though, is Democrats in the Senate knew that this was going to fail. Chuck Schumer knew that this was not passing, but he said it is important going into midterm elections that we establish where we are in our belief of voting access. So
Let's draw a line in the sand. Let's see who's on one side and who's on the other.
Inform voters of where you stand.
Well, now they know. So, what can you do? You should be looking up to see if your state has any of these restrictive voting laws be going through your state legislature. And you need to be calling your members of your legislature to say, hey, don't pass any of that shit. I want to make sure that voting is something that anyone who wants to vote should be able to vote without all these restrictions. So make sure you're contacting your local representatives and tell them, we want the people to vote, mama.
Get out there and vote. Vote.gov is a great resource to figure out how you're able to register to vote. You can also use the resource that we have used in preparing for this podcast, which is BrennanCenter.org. If you go to their research reports and look up voting law roundup from December of 2021, it gives a nice breakdown of some of the new restrictive laws, and will even give you the bill numbers for those states. So you can see just at a glance what your state has suggested, whether they've been passed or not.
Check the show notes for more details. And that's the news that caught our eye this week. Now, Mason, tell me, what are we doing next?
We're going to be doing our section on Christine Jorgensen, our queer person in history.
It's the segment where we highlight a queer person in history we think you should know. It's my favorite segment.
I love this segment so much. I love being able to look at icons and allies of the LGBTQAI plus communities. I think that's important to know where we've come from, who's helped us get to where we are today, and really sing the praises for those trailblazers that have come before us. Now, for those of you who don't know about Christine Jorgensen, Christine was one of the first, if not the first, celebrated trans women of America. Okay, so Christine was born on May 30th, 1926 in Bronx, New York, and would later be a World War II vet who would transition from male to female in the 1950s.
I mean, that's wild.
That's insane. Absolutely mind-blowing. At some point during the process of the 2-year transition period that Christine spent over in Europe in 1950 to 1952, the word got out somewhere, and she was actually welcomed home with a feature in Life magazine titled XGI Becomes Blonde Beauty. I mean, it's absolutely insane that at that time period in America, when we're looking at like Stepford Wife type mindset of American society, that they're not only discussing a trans person, but they're celebrating the trans person and celebrating the fact that medical technology had advanced so far that they could do such a transition. Uh, Not long after graduating high school, she was drafted into the army. On May 31st, 1944 is actually when her papers of registration are stamped. But during 1946, right before, she gets her hands on this book called The Male Hormone, which was a book that discusses, as it says, the male hormone, talking about estrogen versus testosterone. And it is authored by Paul DeCruyff. And this really sparked the idea of transgenderism in Christine. She already had this notion of I'm a female in a male's body, but finally she has some other external validation of yes, this is a thing. Like other people are seeing this, and other people that are not identifying as the same thing as I am are identifying this and seeing this. There's something in the medical community that I can chase after, right? She ends up getting introduced or bumping into a endocrinologist by the name of Christian Hamburger. Now, Christian agrees to do the experimental surgery for free for Christine Jorgensen. So Christine has all this celebrity press, is like the blonde bombshell now. But it wasn't all champagne, caviar, bubble dreams, right? As soon as this story comes out, the press starts reaching out to Dr. Hamburg over in Denmark. Starts trying to reach out to other medical professionals in Europe that Christine had been in touch with. They find out through the release of medical information that at this point, Christine is lacking female genitalia because she had not had that part of the surgery. So then the rhetoric turns from XGI becomes blonde beauty to XGI becomes altered male. And now poor Christine is having to deal with those negative experiences and that negative press. It wasn't until 1954 that she was finally able to have the vaginoplasty surgery and then was able to kind of break through that wall of negative press. Not that that was her intention, but just to be able to shut those people up and say, no, I am a fully realized woman now based on their demands, not her own, based on their demands. And unfortunately, we did lose Miss Jorgensen in May 1989. She died from cancer. But she was a trailblazer and an icon for the trans and queer communities.
Salute to you.
Salute to you, our veteran.
That does it for us here on the podcast this week. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow us on social media. You can follow the show on Twitter at With a Gay Twist. You can follow me at ZacharyPenn48.
Or you can follow me at Real Mason Dixon.
You can also email us at withagaytwist@gmail.com. Make sure to give us a rating on your favorite podcast app so that other fabulous queens such as yourself can find us. And remember, being queer is political. Bye, girl, bye.
Later.